The warden had his eyes on a visitor, a woman who came to see her husband behind bars. As soon as she entered, he offered her a cup of coffee. What she didn't know was that something wicked had been slipped into her drink. Within moments of taking a sip, she grew dizzy and passed out on the couch. What happened next was sickening. The warden approached her with a twisted grin, and as he always did, he recorded everything on his phone, using it as leverage. 3 minutes later, the woman lay unconscious, and her husband was brought in to witness the scene. The warden had a cruel habit. He took revenge in the most despicable way imaginable. Every woman who came to visit was subject to his inspection. Besides, Tae-sik was the one responsible for the death of the warden's only son. Just days earlier, the warden's son had been living large at a nightclub, flaunting his power and indulging in illegal substances. One of the women, Horan, refused to go along with his demands, but when she tried to resist, the others around her kept silent. After all, he was the warden's son who dared to speak up. When all hope seemed lost, Tae-sik, the head of security, burst in. Horan wasn't just any woman, she was his forbidden love. The warden's son swaggered forward, wine bottle in hand, only to slip and fall right onto the bottle's shattered edge. The accident was fatal, but instead of mourning, the warden blamed Tae-sik, and just like that, the protector became a prisoner. On his very first day at this prison, Tae-sik was singled out for a special welcome. Jong-hoon's boss, acting on orders from higher-ups, was tasked with making Tae-sik regret stepping foot inside.
뭘 꼬라봐 이 개새끼야, 눈 깔아야!
But after just one encounter, Tae-sik landed a brutal sidekick that sent his attacker crumpling to the ground. As the head of security at the largest nightclub in town, Tae-sik's strength was legendary, and everyone in the prison noticed. Among the onlookers was Dae-ho, the feared leader of the Black Tiger gang. When the guard mentioned Tae-sik's name, Dae-ho paused, then smirked. Clearly, he knew exactly what kind of man he was dealing with. Jong-hoon had no idea he'd crossed paths with a real force of nature. The feud between the Black Tiger gang and the Snake Syndicate had been simmering for years, neither side ever willing to back down. Fights here were settled in the ring, something they called circle duels. Even the guards rarely stepped in, since only one fighter from each gang could enter the ring, and stepping out meant instant defeat. There were rarely any mass injuries. It was more like a prison-style cage match. But once inside the ring, it was all-out brutality. Every punch landed hard, and most fighters left battered and bruised. At last, it was time for the two gang leaders to face off. Jong-hoon may have been taken down hard by Tae-sik, but that didn't mean he was some weakling. In fact, he was among the toughest behind bars. Knowing he couldn't win one-on-one, Dae-ho called in his crew for a full-on gang attack. Chaos erupted, fists were flying, blood was spilling, and only then did the guards finally step in. The warden couldn't afford a deadly riot under his watch. Later, Dae-ho was summoned to the disciplinary office. He lacked Jong-hoon's raw power, but he had wealth, and he wasn't shy about donating every so often. The guards had no problem with the perks. Dae-ho even walked out with a fresh pack of cigarettes. He had to keep him on his good side. But when it was Jong-hoon's turn, the guard captain's attitude did a full 180. He treaded carefully, afraid that upsetting Jong-hoon might cost him his life. Both men were dangerous. They couldn't afford to offend either. That's when he thought of another tough customer, Tae-sik. Maybe this guy could make the two gang bosses feel fear and ultimately bring some peace to the prison. Tae-sik figured, if he could really unite all the inmates, even the warden might start sweating. What he didn't know was that Dae-ho was already thinking about switching sides, because he knew exactly what Tae-sik was capable of. Back in the day, when Dae-ho was just a low-level debt collector, the woman who got busted was none other than Horan. Tae-sik was just a low-level security guy in the neighborhood back then. Their first meeting? Tae-sik knocked out two of Dae-ho's teeth. Dae-ho watched Tae-sik climb the ranks step by step until everyone started calling him boss. Word spread fast. Jong-hoon caught wind too. Even if he hated it, he had no choice but to swallow his pride and show some respect.
네가 독사구나.
예, 목포 독사파 이정훈이라.
나이는 누가 더 많냐?
제가 4살 많습니다, 형님.
정훈아, 나 있는 동안 대호를 형님처럼 생각하면 안 돼.
Dae-ho extended his hand first. Jong-hoon hesitated, then reluctantly shook it. From that moment on, he was no longer the prison's top dog, just another one of Tae-sik's crew. The prison entered an era of peace like never before. Gang members from both sides sat together, shooting the breeze without a hint of trouble. In the end, the place even got recognized as a model prison. To reward Tae-sik, The head prison guard brought him a feast of crispy fried chicken along with everything else he asked for, but this picture of peace and prosperity was the last thing the warden wanted to see. He had just returned from his son's funeral, only to find that the man he blamed was thriving behind bars.
난 이곳처럼 개판의 교도소는 본 적이 없어.
저희 교도소 말입니다. 얼마 전에 전국 모범 교도소로 선정된 이태식이라고 이 전국구 주목이 한 명 들어오면서 분위기가 싹 바뀌었습니다.
The head guard had no clue about the personal grudge between the warden and Tae-sik. He kept praising Tae-sik as a decent guy, even wanted to help him get a sentence reduction until the warden dropped a bomb on him. Only then did it hit him. The warden's son had just died, and Tae-sik was in prison for murder. Could the two be connected?
수정하겠습니다.
난 말이야. 이태식만 잡으면 돼.
It was at that moment the head guard's suspicion solidified. No matter how much he liked Tae-sik, he had to protect his job even if it meant becoming the warden's lapdog. He doubled the labor, cut food rations. 5 men shared 1 bowl of rice and started beating inmates. Tae-ho, unable to take it anymore, finally asked what was really going on.
소장 바뀌었다. 세상이 바뀌었다고. 그리고
He couldn't believe the answer. Just as he was about to tell Tae-sik, the warden suddenly ordered all 3 gang bosses to be locked up early. Then came a surprise raid on all the cells with drugs planted in Tae-sik's bunk. Even though the warden knew his son had died from an accidental overdose, he still blamed everything on Tae-sik. If that man hadn't been there, maybe his son wouldn't have fallen. But what the warden refused to admit was if it hadn't been Tae-sik, someone else would have shown up. The only thing that changed was the target of his revenge. Bad luck just happened to fall on Tae-sik. Blinded by obsession, the warden kept taking it out on Tae-sik until he collapsed from the beatings, wanting to trap him in prison forever alive. But barely the warden forced the head guard to abuse his power and find a way to extend Tae-sik's sentence indefinitely. Though the head guard was reluctant, he chose his paycheck over his conscience. He found a junkie inside the prison and pressured him to testify that the drugs had come from Tae-sik. But even that couldn't ease the warden's grief over his son's death. He set his sights on Horan next. Not only did he force himself on her, he even planned to sell her off to work the streets. To avoid any mishaps, the warden brought in Jong-hoon, promising he parole, but the real goal was to make sure Horan suffered. And who could say no to that kind of offer? Jong-hoon had always resented Tae-sik anyway. This was rock bottom. Things couldn't get any worse. But the next day, a prisoner suddenly shouted he smelled a corpse. A guard rushed over, thinking Tae-sik had died. He opened the cell door in a panic. The floor was smeared with disgusting filth. And just as he stepped in, he tripped, then got knocked out cold. By the time he came to, Tae-sik was already dressed in a guard's uniform. He casually walked out into the open, then slipped away and found Dae-ho in secret to share his plan. A group of inmates formed a human ladder, making it look like a prison break was underway. The scene instantly erupted into chaos while Tae-sik quietly slipped out the back and vanished from the prison. What he didn't know was that the head guard had seen everything and it was all part of the warden's master plan. This was the only way to make sure Tae-sik got life in prison. Letting Jong-hoon out early? That was to keep tabs on Horan, the perfect bait. Because the first person Tae-sik would go after once he escaped was Horan. If word got out about the escape, the warden's job would be on the line. But if he caught Tae-sik and then made it public, it would be a massive win. So everything had to stay under wraps. Sure enough, Tae-sik went straight to Jong-hoon's turf. With his insane fighting skills, he demolished the gang in no time.
독사 어딨나?
1km 정도 시내 밖으로 가면 용깃거리를 그때.
Once he had the address, he raced over. Horan was sitting in a massage room, waiting for her next client. Just as she was about to end her own life, a man suddenly appeared before her. Just as he was about to take Horan and leave, a voice stopped them in their tracks. It was Jong-hoon waiting all along, and he didn't come alone. He also brought along a towering enforcer. At first, they thought this big guy was the real deal, but a few quick kicks were all it took to drop him. Jong-hoon, however, showed no fear. He'd always believed he was stronger than Tae-sik. Then, out of nowhere, Jong-hoon suddenly dropped to his knees. He sincerely apologized to Tae-sik. As Tae-sik let his guard down, Jong-hoon stealthily drew a knife from his waistband and stabbed him right in the kidney. Turns out, his so-called strength wasn't in his fists, but in his cunning. But even with a sneak attack, he still wasn't a match for Tae-sik. Though wounded, the tiger still had bite. Dragging Horan with him, Tae-sik fled the scene. They hid in an abandoned building, barely evading the pursuing thugs. Tae-sik knew he couldn't get far. He told Horan to run, he'd stay and draw them away. She didn't want to leave, but this was the only way Tae-sik could protect her. Not long after she slipped out, Jong-hoon came chasing after them. Seeing the battered old man, he thought he had the upper hand again. Jong-hoon never played by the rules. He slammed his fist right into Tae-sik's wound. The blow was brutal. Tae-sik dropped. Weakened and out of fight, Jong-hoon pulled out his knife once more, ready to end it only to have it snatched away in a flash. In a sudden twist, Tae-sik turned the blade and stabbed Jong-hoon. Both men collapsed, neither had any strength left to go on. The knife had struck a vital spot. As Jong-hoon lay dying, regret finally crept in.
같이 들어가자. 지금쯤이면 형님 견적 던져놨을게. 이참에 교도소장 확실하게 해주시오.
With trembling hands, he pulled out the phone he'd gotten after his release. On it were recordings, evidence of every shady deal he made with the warden. Tae-sik made the call. He turned himself in. Back at the prison, the warden was still laughing and chatting with the commissioner, unaware that his downfall was moments away. Suddenly, reporters burst into the room, shouting someone had escaped prison and turned himself in. The commissioner's expression turned ice cold. With cameras rolling, he no longer cared about old friendships.
핸드폰 당장 압수해.
예.
A staff member picked up the warden's phone and everything came to light. On it were videos of inappropriate visits from married women.
면회 온 여자 성추행이나 하고, 가록수도 숨겨줘.
아닙니다.
모범교도소 만들어놨더니만 아수라판으로 만들어.
본부장님 모함입니다.
야, 당장 체포해.
The corrupt warden was finally arrested, and the one who benefited most? The head guard, now next in line for the warden's seat. In the end, Tae-sik was sent back to prison. All the inmates knelt, welcoming the legendary boss back to his throne. In the final scene, the new warden and Tae-sik shared a knowing glance as if everything had gone according to plan. A smile, a spark in the story's biggest twist left hanging in the air.